On the 2nd of February, Social Breakfast held an event at the Birmingham Central Library to mark the release of the book Jilted Generation. This book, written by Ed Hauker and Shiv Malik, highlights the plight of young people in Britain who now face debt, unemployment and even homelessness. Myself and Alicia managed to get an interview with the authors before the event, whilst James and Geeta captured the opinions of those that attended.
Guys, just wanted to quick interview for Social Breakfast. What made you decide to write the book?
Well, it was a curious thing. What happened was, I had a kind of sense, and Shiv had a kind of sense, that young people in Britain were in a curiously weak and kind of vulnerable position in terms of some of the basics of life, housing and jobs, how politics treats them and so on and so forth. And that was our hunch, and we had a whole series of slightly long and kind of torturous conversations about it, and then decided actually to go and try and look and see if there was any evidence that would show this. And Shiv actually spent a lot of time at the British Library and digging through government records, and built up a picture using statistics and new evidence of what the circumstances for young people in Britain were. And we found actually that they were much, much worse than we thought. So that's how we got into writing the book.
It's starting to have an impact. People are picking up the phrases, and thinking about things in generational terms, thinking about things in terms of the long term as well. And that's probably the best thing that we could have done, was to sort of get people to have that mindset. Actually, what are young people getting? I think it's also changed politics a little bit. The language that's going on, and obviously in conjunction with the student protests and the cuts that are happening to young people, this book has become perhaps more important than we ever thought it would be.
One of the really interesting things about the book actually is, slightly before we published our book, David Willett, who's the kind of university's minister, published a book about the baby boomers, who are this generation of people who are basically our parents' generation, born between the kind of late 1940s and 1960s, where he said that they had to be much more generous towards the way in which they kind of treated young people in Britain. They were kind of threatening their future. And for our money, he didn't go anywhere near far enough in that book.
I think I'd add to that as well. If you look at the Comprehensive Spending Review, which is the series of cuts, they really hit young people hard, really, really hard. So it's not just about student fees. The housing budget's been slashed. So if you're thinking about getting a house, any time, whether it's a social house or buying your own house, for example, that's going to be incredibly difficult. And then if you look at sort of youth centres closing down, those are things that are going to be stripped. The Future Jobs Fund, that also got stripped out, one of the first things to get stripped out from government spending. So there's a whole series of things which almost deliberately impact upon young people, we would say. So if you kind of notice that, like, people in houses over the last 10, 15 years have been using their house like a cash machine, going, oh yeah, I'll just take out an extra loan and then go on another holiday, or do this or do that, or buy another car. And you're wondering, well, where is that money coming from? If they're treating it like cash machine, well, it's young people who are behind that cash machine, feeding their hard work and labour and sacrifice into that. So effectively, older people can enjoy a better standard of living, which is one we argue is desperately unfair and a really bad way to run an economy. What we certainly do know is that we haven't been thinking long term about communal resources. So, for example, we haven't built any social housing in the last 15 years at least. It's actually zero. And the people on the waiting lists, no one mentions this, but the people on the waiting list waiting for social housing are generally young people, because they're the ones coming up through the system, right? And therefore waiting for a house. And that list goes to about 1.7 million families. So that translates to about 4.5 million people almost. Again, they're young. And why hasn't that investment happened?
If you don't invest in young people, if you don't invest in new workers and future taxpayers, then, in a couple of decades' time, you start to see very big problems. And those problems exist regardless of what your politics are.
Only the sort of young person network is one of desperation, optimism, but unfortunately it's not very well warranted. Gaining internships, absolutely very, very difficult to get a job without an internship now. It's actually more like a long-term interview than an internship. And the opportunities that I currently would have thought and was told that I would have had as a child, and then going into university and then coming out the other end, aren't there. So this book very much speaks about me.
Hello, I've had a very enjoyable evening with the Jilted Generation. I'm just looking forward to Jilted Generation 2, which is how do we bring Britain's youth back into the black.
case, if we as a generation don't think we're worth anything, then we're going to be exploited, right? And should we feel like we're worth anything? Well, actually, we're one of the best educated, most technically savvy, and brightest generations this country's ever had.